We continue to bring you the reliable information, the most important briefings. As our civil rights attorney, Roger Archibald, are you on the panel?
I am here, JR. Good to see you and good morning to everyone.
Good morning, Roger. Would you like to lean in on what we just spoke about?
Yeah, absolutely. I think to understand where we are today, as I have repeatedly said in the past, we have to go back and appreciate what happened and how that catapulted us along a trajectory that unfortunately we have been mired in. For example, if you want to look back at the source document of everything, that's the Declaration of Independence, right? That's the source document. So you look at that document and you look at the folks who are the signatories on that document, we call them the Founding Fathers. There were 9 of them. Of the 9 Founding Fathers, 6 of them were slave owners, starting off with Washington. George Washington, he started off his life at age 11 by inheriting 10 slaves from his father. He's a slave owner, and he had those slaves and bought and sold other slaves throughout his lifetime, right? Then you want to look at Alexander Hamilton. He's someone that's revered. He was not a president, but he's one of the signatories. He was a slave owner. He advocated slavery. Next was Benjamin Franklin. He owned slaves also, right? We revere Ben Franklin as a great leader, but he's a slave owner. And it goes on and on. Those who weren't slave owners were actually hypocrites. For example, John Adams, he didn't own any slaves, but he had no problem with slavery. He did nothing to abolish slavery. And we revere him as someone of great stature in this country, and we shouldn't. Samuel Adams wasn't a president, but one of the signatories. He owned slaves as well. We have another one, Thomas Jefferson. As the bar president said, we have high schools named after him, right? We have monuments in his honor. He's a hypocrite. I'm going to read something that he said. He says, slavery is a moral depravity and it's a hideous blotch on our society. Nevertheless, he owned slaves. What does that say about him? An absolute hypocrite, right? We have our 4th president, James Madison, outright owned slaves, had several slaves throughout his lifetime. And then we had John Jay. We all know about John Jay College. John Jay became one of the first chief justices. He was named that by President Washington. John Jay, absolute hypocrite. He owned slaves, but yet he said he is an abolitionist. He stood for the abolition of slavery, yet he owned slaves. So when you look at the history of the country, the most revered document, our Declaration of Independence, it was signed off by men who either owned slaves or embraced slavery. So how could we continue to revere that document as well as the men that signed off on that document? If we really want to move forward with the Black Lives Matter movement, that has got to be a part of it because it's the source document that put us where we are today. And that's my view on that. Now, I think you also might want to move into the issue of the monuments that are engraved on Mount Rushmore because they are inextricably linked in terms of whether or not we're being true to the Black Lives Movement, whether or not we're being true that yes, we want to have change because what has transpired in the past has been so egregious. Who is on Mount Rushmore, right? We have 4 people on Mount Rushmore. We have Washington, we have Lincoln, we have Roosevelt, and the 4th one is, let's see, Roosevelt, and we have Thomas Jefferson. Those are the 4, right? They're 4 presidents. You want to talk about those 4 presidents? Everyone reveres Lincoln because he wrote the Emancipation Proclamation. Yeah, that is true. And he freed the slaves. But throughout his lifetime, he had no problem with saying that Black men and white men are not equal. They could never be equal. He, being Lincoln, he did not grant the slaves citizenship. He absolutely did not, because he didn't believe they were equal to white men. He freed them. And the reason for freeing them, and if you did some research, I think it will bear out what my point was, more a political military maneuver more so than a maneuver to emancipate people that he believed was enslaved and should be freed and was equal to that. The slaves provided a boon to the Southern economy, and they helped in the war effort. And if, as the president, if he freed those slaves, they will no longer be able to fight with the Union, not the Union, but the Confederacy. They will no longer support the Confederate Army. And that's what led to the end of the Civil War. It wasn't because he wanted to free black people. So you got to take Lincoln with a grain of salt. I'm going to read a quote from him. He says, "I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races." That's Lincoln talking. Lincoln is saying that. So be careful who we treasure as our heroes, because all four of those men that sit atop of Mount Rushmore were racist and or slave owners. A lot of people revere Teddy Roosevelt. I'm going to read something about Teddy Roosevelt for you. He says, "As a race and in mass, they are altogether inferior to whites." That's Teddy Roosevelt speaking, okay? And Roosevelt, yeah, he was in the 19th century, died in 1919, but he played a major role in how the country at the dawn of the 19th century was looked at, was supervised, was controlled. At the time of his birth, slavery was still the law of the land. But by the time he died, he embraced Jim Crow because he said Jim Crow is the way basically to keep the blacks under control. That was Teddy Roosevelt. So if we could have a Teddy Roosevelt, a racist, up on Mount Rushmore, Abraham Lincoln, a racist and segregationist, up on Mount Rushmore, Washington, up on Mount Rushmore, a slave owner, Hamilton, another slave owner. If we could have those four white men atop Mount Rushmore, we most certainly could have a Barack Obama up there, the first black president. And what did Barack Obama do, not just for the black population, but for America in general? You want to start? He put DACA in place. DACA has saved the deportation of almost 1 million youngsters who were brought here illegally or undocumented rather. They are now maintained in this country. A month and a half ago, the Supreme Court ruled that DACA is not to be rescinded. The Trump administration, one of the first things they wanted to do was eliminate DACA, right? The Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. DACA stays. He saved those 700 to 1 million lives. We also had the Obamacare. Most people didn't understand Obamacare, but I'll tell you who did. The 20 or so million Americans who all of a sudden had coverage, who didn't have coverage before. Americans who no longer had to worry, well, if I have a pre-existing condition, I'm not going to be covered. Or my insurer could triple, quadruple my premiums, or worse yet, kick me off, give me no coverage altogether. These are some of the things that Obama did. Who remembers 2009 when the economy was crumbling, when Chrysler, Ford was about to go under, right? The automotive industry was in dire straits. Obama came to the rescue and he bailed them out. And the bailout wasn't, I'm giving you free money. They were loans that was made to the auto industry and they were paid back with interest. And then soon after that, what happened? We had the collapse of the financial markets as a result of all of the mortgages that the banks were giving, and primarily those mortgages were being given to people of color, mortgages that they knew were not appropriate mortgages. And most of those mortgages failed, the banks failed, and the economy started to fail. What did Obama do? He put together this TARP. And TARP stood for Troubled Asset Recovery Program. And that again bailed out the banks, but it wasn't gifts or grants. What it was loans. And it jump-started the economy and put us back where we needed to be, and it put in place stringent requirements for these financial institutions to follow. In essence, they couldn't play games on the stock market with the money that belonged to their depositors. And that's what they were doing before. And on and on and on and on. So I think we make a good case for the first Black president to sit atop Mount Rushmore. Because if those four could be there with the checkered past that they have had, absolutely Obama would stand head and shoulders above them.
100%, Roger, 100%. We will take a commercial break, and we will be back with our civil rights attorney and Dr. Casper.